This is $12.50 of Lego clone bricks I bought from the dollar store. These are the CSX, former B&O, crossings at Eastern Avenue in Baltimore, Maryland. Today we'll talk about how I turned these blocks, a few detail parts, and some Gatorfoam, styrene, and insulation foam into a realistic representation of these bridges. We'll also talk a little bit about the mystery of the disappearance of Joey the Geek. He basically disappeared a few months ago, leaving people to wonder about his fate. So what really happened? Joey the Geek is in the wind. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot, where we give model railroaders the knowledge, tools, and services they need to build a model railroad and the inspiration to do it right now. This is part 4 in a series about building the Eastern Avenue section on my Monument City Terminal Division layout. I'll provide links to the first 3 sections in the description below if you want to catch up. There are actually 2 bridges very close together where the railroad crosses Eastern Avenue in Baltimore, Maryland. The first is a larger span that goes over the divided 4-lane section of Eastern Avenue. The other is a much older, smaller bridge that crosses a small access road to the Crown Cork and Seal building, which incidentally is also labeled Eastern Avenue just to make things more confusing. Note that on the prototype, this line has only a single track on it, but for the purposes of the layout, I needed 2. For a very long time, I had nothing but a piece of ceiling tile and a piece of foam insulation here. It was functional and we ran trains over it for a long time, but it sure didn't look realistic. Speaking of trains,
Hey, did you ever hear about that Joey the Geek guy? I heard someone took him to the train station. Whatever that's supposed to mean.
but let's get back to the story. Why did it take so long? Well, it took me a very long time to figure out how I was going to build the bridges. Initially, I was going to use a micro-engineering kit for the small crossing, but it turned out that the plate girders were just too big for the size of that bridge. As for the big bridge, I was just stumped on how to represent that full stop. Solutions popped up in both cases. The first in the form of leftover pieces from the I-895 bridge project, and the second came from leaning into my use of Lego. In this case, the inexpensive Lego clone bricks from the dollar store that I've talked about in previous videos as well. I'll link to both of those above and in the description below. Affiliate links to a bunch of the tools and items I use will be in the description as well. One thing to note here is that when I was building the Eastern Avenue section, I worked on the bridges, the roads, the sidewalk, the greenery, all at the same time. But in this video, I'm going to cover each bridge separately, so it's going to look a little bit like we're taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But trust me, it all comes together in the end. I'll cover the scenery bits in later videos. Some spoilers here, but I want to start with the bridge surfaces. For a while, I didn't have a great plan for what the decks for the bridges would be made from. Originally, the small span would have a deck integrated into the bridge itself, but that didn't work out so well, as we'll see. As the plan came together, though, for the larger span, I decided that I would be gluing the sides of the bridge directly to the deck, and that meant using something that was going to be able to take adhesive. Realistically, that something was never going to be the shaped ceiling tile that I'd been using. It's just too unstable for that purpose. After thinking about it, I decided that Gatorfoam was the solution. Why? A few reasons. Gatorfoam's wood veneer is very solid. It's impervious to moisture and it's easy to cut, so I could work it with basic tools to the shape I needed. And I ended up making adjustments almost to the very end of this project, so that ability came in very handy. Plus, both the veneer and the interior foam take adhesive very well. Wood glue for the veneer and liquid nails for projects for the foam. So I used 1/2-inch Gatorfoam for the entire span. I cut it to shape, and we actually attached and wired the track to it before doing all this construction. I was then able to take this piece in and out at will while I was working on this section. I didn't actually glue it down until pretty late in the process. Now you can get your Gatorfoam from my friend Dave Myers. Contact him at gatorfoam.net and don't forget to tell him that Joe Parker from the Pixel Depot sent you. Again, I'll put a link to that in the description. Check out this bridge. I mean, come on, this is clearly a micro-engineering bridge, right? Absolutely, assuming I picked the right kit. So that was the plan. We even built it. I didn't pick the right kit. When it was finished, the proportions were all wrong. The plate girders were huge. It would have looked over-engineered for such a small span and would have had to do some funky alignments with the track to get it to flow well. So it was back to the drawing board and even more delays. Then one modeling day, while moving things from one side of the layout surface to the other, something none of us ever do, right? I realized 3 things. 1, I still had a lot of the thin girder pieces left over from when we ripped the O-scale bridge girders I used as the basis for the I-895 bridge. 2, They would look great to represent that bridge section for the small span. And 3, add some 100,000 styrene to the bottom cord and they would be just about the perfect size to attach to the Gatorfoam. Problem solved. I love it when a plan comes together. For the abutments on the small bridge, I'd purchased some Chooch Enterprises stone walls that I planned to cut down to replicate the stepped look of the prototype and to use micro-engineering bridge shoes on top of those for a realistic look. After cutting the abutments down with the Dremel bandsaw, I painted them grimy black using my usual Rust-Oleum chalked paint. I then used pan pastels to weather them to look like the prototype. After that, I glued the styrene to the bottom of the cut girder pieces to create a solid cord, and then also painted them grimy black as well. These were looking pretty weathered in the photos that I had, so I liberally added pan pastels to dirty them up. And I think they came out pretty well. Incidentally, those pan pastels clean up pretty well with Lysol wipes. After painting the base a less pink color, I used liquid nails for projects to attach the abutments to the side of my foam canyon. Using CA, I attached the micro-engineering bridge shoes to the top of the abutments. I also used liquid nails for projects to attach the plate girder sides to the Gatorfoam. I made sure to leave a small lip so that I could put a layer of ballast down later, even though that wouldn't be really prototypical. And then it was on to the large bridge. The biggest problem here was the unusual shapes of the abutments, especially on the left side. While I wasn't going for absolute fidelity on anything here, I did want it to be as close as possible. No commercial offering was going to come close to the look I was after. I thought about building them up using heavy-duty styrene shapes, but I decided against it for 2 reasons. 1, it was going to be difficult to get everything cut to the exact dimensions I wanted, and 2, it was going to get expensive real quick. When I started pricing out the evergreen styrene at the sizes I would need, it was just too much. So what to do? Follow my own advice, obviously. I started thinking of alternatives, and it occurred to me that Lego was going to be a good solution. I could leverage the different sizes and thicknesses of the blocks, and I would also be sure that everything was going to be square. Now that's not to say I gave up entirely on styrene. I did decide to use 5,000 styrene to laminate the entire abutment structure and to get a smooth surface, mostly smooth surface. I would also use styrene in a couple of other places too. Sure, I might have to find a way to deal with the nubs on the tops of the Lego pieces, but I figured I could get around that. Here's how. First, I did some quick calculations of how many 2x2, 2x3, and 2x4 blocks I was going to need for the project. Then I figured out how many of each came in the packages at the dollar store. This told me I would need 10 bags of blocks. This would also give me an assortment of other pieces to use, with a lot still left over for later projects. Now I did have to visit 2 different dollar stores to acquire that many bags of Lego blocks, but I was out and passing more than one anyway, so no big deal. So about those nubs. I was still going to end up using some styrene for the project, mostly for the road structure and the sidewalks. And so I decided, because I would be using styrene for the sidewalks, it'd be easiest to build the abutments upside down, so that way the nubs would be at the bottom and would be easily hidden by that sidewalk surface. I would then use some styrene to represent the heavy concrete slab at the front of the abutment next to the sidewalk. Now I started with the abutment on the left. It's the thinner and less complicated of the two. Here I did have to cut off some nubs so that it would lie flat on the foam that formed the border of the underpass, but that was easily achieved with a heavy-duty sprue cutter. Although that was months ago and I'm still finding stray nubs in the layout room. The idea here was to build the abutment so that I could slide it from the bottom and have it rest on each side of the Gatorfoam span. I did have to make some adjustments to the width of the Gatorfoam, but this was easy to do with a rasp. The pieces where I cut the nubs would then sit on the insulation foam, and I trimmed the span a little more to make that work. I test fit the parts with the materials I was going to use for the sidewalks and the railings frequently to make sure everything was going to fit. I didn't want any surprises later. My plan was to use another piece of strip styrene to represent the concrete at the top of the bridge deck, and some leftover micro-engineering pieces glued to the sides for the plate girders. In order to get the look of the prototype, I wanted to make sure that my abutments sat just higher than the surface of the deck. This would allow me to attach the piece that was supposed to represent the concrete cord across the top of the sides of the Gatorfoam, and it would also provide a fence of sorts for any ballast I laid down later. Now, to get the concrete span to sit correctly, at one point I determined I needed just a little bit more height out of my abutments. This is another place where using Lego-style blocks came in handy. Using the really thin pieces, it was very easy to add just enough height. Speaking of concrete, as in concrete shoes, let's get another opinion on what happened to Joey the Geek.
I heard they pulled him back in. Just when he thought he was out, they pulled him back in.
Now it was time to laminate the abutments. I did this by using Tester's model glue, which I applied pretty liberally to the Lego structure. Then I laid the thin, unpainted styrene on the surface. Once I'd done that to both abutments, I trimmed the excess off, and then I cut the thick 125 by 375 thousandths styrene for the fronts. Now one side ended up a little short, so I did some plastic surgery by adding a small piece of styrene to the end. I glued it all together, and once all that dried, it was off to the paint booth to give it some color. Now because it was so thin and the way that the glue laid down on the side of the abutments, there are some places where you can make out where the block lines were. I didn't think this was a big deal because I figured it would just look like the forms that they had used to pour the concrete. Finally, I glued the painted styrene to the side of the bridge and clamped it so it could set. While I waited for that, I painted and did a little bit of weathering with my Copic sketch markers to add some rust spots. I only did a few since my thinking was that back in the 80s, this bridge would be looking much newer and wouldn't be quite as rusty as it is today. Now the final step was to attach the plate girder pieces, and then I could call these done. Who am I? I'm Joey the Geek. In case you were wondering, yes, I am Joey the Geek, and I'm not dead. I am hoping to be back on a more regular production schedule, though, and I do want to thank you for your patience. For more great information, check out these links at the left of your screen. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.